Okay, we are going to finish up the last part of lesson 5.04, Seeking Perfection. This was a long reading lesson. Okay, picture of a school. It says reformers sought to expand educational opportunities for children in both urban and rural settings like this country school painted by Winslow Homer. Reforms in education. And this is something that's going to be very interesting to all of you because it affects you as students in education. In 1816, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be." Jefferson repeatedly emphasized that if democracy, government by the people, was to succeed, the people must be educated and well informed. But in the early 1800s, opportunities for education were very limited. New England offered free elementary schooling, a product of the Puritan emphasis on teaching children how to read the Bible. But in most of the United States, school attendance was spotty at best. In many cases, parents either had to pay for their children's education or endure the embarrassment of having them identified as charity cases, which allowed them to attend schools set aside for the poor. The quality of education was unpredictable, with schoolmasters often knowing little more than their pupils, which never happens today. Don't anybody you think you're smarter than me? Just kidding, just joking. Horace Mann in public schools. Beginning in the 1830s, Horace Mann started a campaign that would change education in his state, the nation, and beyond. Mann, a brilliant lawyer and Massachusetts state legislator, embraced many reform movements. He supported efforts to ban liquor, tobacco, profanity, and even ballet dancing. But his most lasting achievement was in the reform of education. Mann fought for a bill in the Massachusetts legislature to create what were called common schools, that is, free, state-funded schools for all children, both boys and girls, regardless of race, class, or religion. Operators of private schools objected to Mann's proposal because they would have to compete with free schools. Some citizens complained they did not want their tax dollars to pay for the education of someone else's brats. But Mann argued that education was necessary in a democratic republic. A republican form of government without intelligence in the people, said Mann, must be on a vast scale what is a madhouse without superintendent or keepers would be on a small one. When his education bill finally passed in 1837, Mann closed his law office and resigned from the legislature to serve as secretary of the first Massachusetts Board of Education. Over the next 10 years, he fought for and won funding to build more schoolhouses, buy better materials, lengthen school terms, and provide higher pay for more qualified instructors. He also established the first public teacher training schools, known as normal schools in the United States. Mann's goals, like those of other education reformers, went beyond training and academic skills. For him, education was also a moral and cultural crusade. He saw education as a way to bring order to what many middle-class people perceived as the threatening unruliness of the urban, mostly immigrant working class. Education, Mann said, provides the means to free ourselves from the low-minded and the vicious, not by their expectoration, but by their elevation. That's a hard sentence to say. And Mann asserted that education, beyond all other divisive human origin, is the great equalizer of the conditions of men. Think about that for a minute. Education is the great equalizer of the conditions of men. Education has the ability to bring everybody to an equal playing field. In his thinking, this lofty democratic ideal went hand in hand with practical economic incentives. Public education, he said, does better than disarm the poor of their hostility toward the rich. It prevents being poor. Politicians and educators in other states, and even in other countries, watched what Horace Mann was doing in Massachusetts. Soon they were modeling their own school systems after the ones he had created, and Mann became known as the father of the common schools. So you can thank public education that you are enjoying right now. As an online school, we are a public online school, and you can thank that to the work of Horace Mann. And here is a little excerpt about the first school for the deaf, which is an interesting read. And you can take time to read through that as well. Horace Mann's final report to the Massachusetts Board of Education. Here's just an excerpt of a primary document of a report he delivered to describe the work of public schools. I'm not going to read through it at this time, but we're going to skip ahead. And I must have missed a page. like right here. There we go. Dorothea Dix, Deforming Prisons and Asylums. On a cold March day in 1841, Dorothea Dix, a 39-year-old former schoolteacher, volunteered to give religious instruction to female inmates at a prison near her home in Massachusetts. Commonality here? Just think for a minute. Horace Mann, he was from Massachusetts. Dorothea Dix was Massachusetts. Massachusetts is in New England, the New England area of the United States. And remember from earlier in the lesson, they talked about how many of these reform movements started in the New England area. Okay, so where was I? She taught her class and was preparing to leave when she noticed about 30 mentally ill people dressed in filthy rags and confined to dark, unheated cells. When Dix asked why their cells had no fires, the jailer told her that fire would be an unnecessary hazard because lunatics could not tell the difference between hot and cold. Dix knew better, but she could not convince the jailer. So she filed a petition at the local courthouse, which she was allowed to do because she was an unmarried woman and because her father was dead. Otherwise, a man would have been expected to file the petition. In response, the judge ordered the jailer to provide heat at once. This action was Dorothea Dix's first success in improving the lives of people with mental illnesses, and it made her wonder if people with mental illnesses were treated so badly near her home, how did they fare elsewhere in Massachusetts? Dix began a private 2-year investigation of every almshouse and jail in the state. Then she wrote a report to the Massachusetts State Legislature in which she described finding people with mental illnesses confined in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, and beaten with rods and lashed into obedience. Dix's report created a furor. The people who ran the institutions denied her charges and accused her of writing sensational and slanderous lies. But Horace Mann soon got involved, and together Mann and Dix convinced the Massachusetts legislature to add a large facility to the state hospital devoted to the needs of people with mental illnesses. Dix began a nationwide campaign for state-supported asylums, hospitals designed specifically for people with mental illness. Over the course of decades, she traveled tens of thousands of miles by train, coach, carriage, and riverboat. Everywhere she went, she inspected jails, almshouses, and even private homes where the mentally ill were hidden. Dix convinced more than a dozen state legislatures to build asylums and provide treatment for people with mental illnesses. At one point, the U.S. Congress approved her plan for a federal system of hospitals for the mentally ill, but President Franklin Pierce vetoed the bill because he thought it would open the door for the federal government to assume responsibility for the nation's poor. As she continued to visit prisons, Dix became alarmed over the conditions in which all prisoners live, not just the mentally disabled. She reported that prisoners were sometimes stripped, tied to posts, and whipped if they uttered a sound when they were supposed to be silent. She argued for more humane treatment of prisoners and remarks on prisons and prison discipline. Dix continued to focus her efforts on helping the mentally ill. In 1848, she returned to Washington, D.C. to press Congress for national standards in institutions that house people with mental illnesses. She was sure she'd be successful because she had the goodwill pretty equally of Democrats and Whigs in Congress. Once in Washington, though, Dix found that no one wanted to talk about mental illness. Congress was too absorbed in arguments over an issue that would eventually tear the United States apart: slavery. And this is the end of today's reading. 341, that's where we were to read to, and the next lesson we'll be talking about abolitionism. So let's review here for a moment from some of the high points of the reading. 2 people came from Massachusetts: Dorothea Dix for campaigning for prison reform and better care for the mentally ill. That's Dorothea Dix. And we have Horace Mann, who was a champion for free public education because that would bring forth a more democratic society where all people had the chance to learn and become equal. Important points there. We also read about the Temperance Society, which is where they encouraged people to abstain from drinking alcohol because of all the problems that too much alcoholic consumption could cause: poverty, abuse, instability, etc. We also read about different utopian societies. We read about Brook Farm, where such notable people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Henry David Thoreau lived, where they tried to achieve a perfect society. We read about the Oneida Society, which produced silverware, remember, and why they were shut down. And that was because of the belief in complex marriages. And we read about the Shakers, and we read about utopian societies, cooperative economic and social arrangements. We read about, in general, the Second Great Awakening. Let's back. I'm going backwards. This is not always the best thing to go backwards. I should probably get to the front, right? The Second Great Awakening. Let me find the key point that I wanted to highlight here from the Second Great Awakening. Okay. But in the Second Great Awakening, revivalists preached that people could choose goodness, and if they did, God would save them. The belief in spiritual self-determination, that you could become a better person and God would save you. They could choose goodness. You're not preordained to be a good or bad person. You could choose to become better. And that built off the reform movements. And we also read about the growth of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, called the Mormons, and why their leader, John Smith, and where does it say? I'm trying to find the... Yes, they were killed by an angry mob. Brigham Young led the Mormons from persecution to the west in Utah, Salt Lake City, and began their settlement there. And those are some of the highlights that you read about in today's 5.04 lesson. So now if we go back, now the next thing you need to do, make sure that you complete the reading guide that you find under lesson resources. You should have done that as we were going through the reading. And then complete the Age of Reform activity online. So let's look at this. This is what you need to complete. And you have to decide which box should they go in. Attempted to get people to drink moderately, later not at all. Which box does that belong to? Yes, temperance reform. Provide treatment for people with mental illness? Prison and asylum reform. Dorothea Dix. She goes with prison and asylum reform. People at the time felt uncomfortable talking about mental illness? Goes with prison and asylum reform. Essential to a democracy. That's Horace Mann. Yes. And speaking of Horace Mann, education reform. Attempted to prevent broken families, lost jobs, and crime. That's the temperance movement. More than a dozen states built asylums. That's going to be asylum reform. Treats inmates humanely. Prison and asylum reform. Lyman Beecher. Which one does he go to? Hopefully you remember temperance reform. American Temperance Society. Temperance reform. People didn't want to pay to educate other people's children. That was some of the arguments against free public education. Create free schools for all children. Abstinence pledges. That goes with temperance reform. Great job, us. Woohoo! We got her done. So then the last thing you'll have to do is go to the 5.04 checkpoint and complete the checkpoint for today. Use your completed reading guide to answer the following questions. One was an obstacle facing the education movement, and residents of utopian societies were attempting to achieve a state of what? The two questions. When you complete them, then you're done with today's lesson. Good luck, and thank you for listening.